The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. At that time, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was hungry. The tempter approached and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become loaves of bread." He said in reply, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and made him stand on the parapet of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and with their hands they will support you, lest you dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Then the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their magnificence. And he said to them, "All these I shall give to you, if you will prostrate yourself and worship me." At this Jesus said to him, "Get away, Satan. It is written, the Lord your God shall you worship, and Him alone shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Once upon a time, a local sheriff was looking for a deputy, and one of his applicants, who was not known to be the brightest bulb on the planet, was called in for an interview. "Okay," began the sheriff, "what is 1 and 1? 11, came the reply. Well, the sheriff thought to himself, "That's not exactly what I meant, but he is right." Then the sheriff asked, "What 2 days of the week start with the letter T?" Very quickly and confidently he looked at the sheriff and said, "Today and tomorrow." The sheriff was again surprised over the answer, one that he had never thought of himself. "Now listen carefully. This is the important question," he said. "Who killed Abraham Lincoln?" Well, the job seeker seemed a little surprised, then thought really hard for a minute, and finally admitted, "I don't have a clue." The sheriff replied, "Well, why don't you go home and work on that one for a while?" Well, the applicant left and wandered over to his pals who were waiting to hear the results of the interview. He greeted them with a cheery smile and said, "The job is mine. I nailed it. The interview was great. First day on the job, and I'm already working on a murder case." And that, my friends, is what happens when the ego gets in the way. On this first Sunday of Lent, traditionally every year, we hear from one of the gospel accounts about the temptation of Jesus in the desert. There are 3 accounts. Mark chapter 1, who gives us the briefest account. Mark is very stingy with details. And then I just proclaimed Matthew chapter 4, and we find the story in Luke chapter 4. John knows nothing at any point in his gospel of the temptation of Jesus. Interesting, eh? But at any rate, the temptation accounts all take place after Jesus has been baptized by John. We're told that the Holy Spirit whisked him into the desert for a period of 40 days. Whenever we hear the Holy Spirit propelling Jesus anywhere, that's the gospel writer's way of saying to us that nothing that happens to Jesus happens by chance. God is overseeing it all. Such is the case in this passage. And then as soon as he emerges from the desert after the testing, he will begin his public ministry. But for now, he goes into the desert of all places. You know, for centuries, and particularly in the Old Testament, the desert was a period of testing, trial, and refinement. Remember, Moses went up on the mountaintop to commune with God for 40 days in the desert. Elijah in 1 Kings 19 will wander into the desert for a period of getting himself regrouped after having been scared to death by Queen Jezebel. And so Jesus goes into the desert for 40 days. And we're told by Matthew, he chooses to fast for 40 days. This is a self-imposed fast. It's not something he heard from anyone. Jesus takes up this fast. And an important message for us as well. Well, Satan emerges, and as always, he's the father of lies, he's the father of deceit, and Satan knows exactly where Jesus is vulnerable. In fact, he always comes after us where he thinks we are most vulnerable. And so, he knows Jesus has been fasting, he knows the Lord is hungry, and so what better way to test Jesus than by food? And so he looks at Jesus and he said, you know what? You're the big cheese guy here. You see all these stones? Turn them into bread. If you've got that kind of power. Notice what Jesus does. He refuses to fall for Satan's trick. Instead, he quotes from the book of the prophet Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verse 3, where it is written, not by bread alone does man live, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Or in other words, even though Jesus could have done exactly what Satan wanted him to do, after all, he is God, he is going to depend upon his Father to take care of him. And he will. Well, not to be deterred, Satan tries a second time. This time he somehow transports Jesus to the holy city of Jerusalem, where he takes him up to the parapet, the crest point of the temple. And he looks at Jesus and says, throw yourself down. You know, and then now Satan's going to quote scripture. He quotes from Psalm 91, where it is written, if you become endangered, God will send a legion of angels who will scoop you up lest you dash your foot against a stone. But you see, Jesus will not fall for this temptation. He is not going to do this to his Father. Instead, he quotes once again to Satan from the book of Deuteronomy, this time chapter 6, verse 16, where it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Then finally, Satan has got to come up with one temptation that will throw Jesus for a loop. And he thinks he finally has it. He takes him to some place, we're not told exactly where, but Jesus is given a panoramic view of all the whole world, the whole kingdoms on the whole earth. And Satan lies to Jesus, and he says, you know what, this all belongs to me. But if you bend your knee before me and worship me, it'll all be yours. Jesus' response, he tells Satan to go away. And then he will quote the final time from the book of Deuteronomy, this time chapter 6, verse 13, where it is written, you shall serve the Lord your God, him alone shall you worship. Jesus will not succumb to Satan's temptations. And interestingly enough, what Satan had quoted in Psalm 91 will now happen to Jesus at the end of this story. We're told that the Father sends his angels to care for Jesus. The point of the story is very simple. The old people of Israel, in Matthew's thinking, after being freed from slavery to Egypt, were led into the wilderness, the desert, for a period of 40 years. And no sooner than they were in safety in the wilderness, after having fled Egypt under God's care, the first thing they do is turn against God. They rebel against God. They want God to be under their control, their dominion. They want God to do what they want him to do, and instantaneously. And as we will see, their experience in the desert was a miserable failure. They were absolutely unfaithful to God. They did not trust God, even when God cared for them. But you see, Jesus is not like the old Israel. In Matthew's thinking, he represents a new Israel, a new son of God, who will be faithful to his Father. The essence of the temptation, well, we hear about it in our first reading today from the book of Genesis. The storyline actually begins in Genesis chapter 2, when God creates the human person, Adam, and puts him in the Garden of Paradise, and he says to Adam, "You may freely eat of any of the fruit of these trees except the one dead center. You eat of it, you're going to die." God's first word to humanity was a word of freedom. We often overlook that. But as today's first reading picks up from chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, look what happens. Eve is now on the scene. Satan, the deceptor, the father of lies, approaches Eve and says, "Have some fruit from that beautiful tree dead center of the garden." Eve says, "No, we were told not to. We were forbidden to do so. If we eat of that tree, we will die." And Satan looks at Eve and tells her a big, fat, bold-faced lie. He says, "I don't know what you were thinking about what God had to say. You eat of the tree, you're not going to die. Here's what's going to happen, though. You're going to become gods. You're going to become gods." That's the essence of sin and temptation. The human attempt to play God. That's what gets us in trouble every time. And that comes down in terms of human behavior as the attempt to control. A couple weeks ago, I talked with you about a study that had been done by the United States government, and the study revealed that the number one cause for disability in America was mental illness. Do you remember that a couple of weeks ago? I got a tremendous amount of feedback, cards, letters, phone calls, emails about that. And as I shared with you, one of the things that it brought out in that study was that 40 million Americans suffer from anxiety disorder. Now some, and I suspect the minority of those people, are struggling with the chemical imbalance in the brain, over which they have no control, and medication is absolutely required. But I think the majority of the people suffer from anxiety that is self-induced. And what do I mean by that? Well, remember I gave you the symptoms that were listed by that study in terms of anxiety and how we do it to ourselves. One of the symptoms was the fact that I can't separate my job from my home life. I bring my job home. And so I stress about it at home when I should be having some downtime. Secondly, an absolutely absurd preoccupation with one's appearance, constantly changing one's appearance because we're just not satisfied with the way we look. Thirdly, being surrounded by stuff, lots of material things, but still feeling very empty and lonely inside. And then finally, the delusional thinking. If I can just go on the right vacation to the right place, if I can just find the most perfect home or the most perfect car, the car of my dreams, or if I can remodel my kitchen for the 11th or 12th time and get it just right, then I'll be happy. Only to discover that when we do those things, we still feel empty and unhappy inside. Yeah, that's the attempt to try to play God. That's the attempt to try to control. And we get ourselves in trouble. We try to play God also with others. And it's interesting, especially in childbearing, which I admit to you is a very, very delicate thing on one hand. On one hand. On the other hand, I've tried to remind parents through the years that children are not made of glass. They are incredibly resilient. When you look through the history just of this country at things we have done with regard to parenting, and the children bounce like rubber balls. They do just fine. But there's a balance in parenting. between being permissive, not giving children a sense of boundaries and limits, and on the other hand, being oppressive. And I've seen some incredible cases of oppressive parenting through the years. The attempt to control those little lives. I see parents through the years who have tried to live vicariously through their children. And where do I see this? In those little rooms over there called the confessional. So many times through the years, children have come in for confession and to talk. And one of the complaints I hear a lot about their little lives is that they are tired. They are tired. And I ask them what they mean by that, because how could you be tired at the age of 8? Well, when I listen to their schedules and what they got through doing the night before, it's no wonder they come to school ill-prepared. They don't have their homework or they don't have it finished. And they're tired. Their schedules are busier than my schedule. And how they can function, I just don't know. Sometimes we try to control their lives by living our childhood vicariously through them. And we meet with disaster when we do. Secondly, spouses at times try to control one another. If your spouse is having the impression that they never quite meet up to your expectations, they never look the way you want them to look, they never behave the way you want them to behave, then you've been playing God with your spouse. And it hurts. And we attempt to play God with ourselves as well. You know, there's nothing wrong with drinking. But did you really taste that beer or that glass of Chardonnay that you consumed? And if you did, why did you need the second, or the fifth, or the sixth, or the eighth? What's going on with drinking of that nature? Deep down inside, I have this inner loneliness, this inner longing, which leaves me feeling at times either stressed or just hungry. And so my human attempt to control is to take that away with alcohol. And it works for a while. The problem is I wake up the next morning and I've got that hunger pain again, but with the headache to match. Did you really taste that beer? Did you enjoy that first glass of wine? Then why the 6th, 7th, and 8th? We do it with food. I remember one time working with a person who just said to me in tears, "I eat to fill the void, Father. I eat to fill the void." This woman was married to a very successful husband, but she was feeling totally empty inside. And so stuffing herself helped her to deal with that anxiety and that stress. Do you know on any given day, by the end of the day, what you had to eat earlier in the day? Could you recall each item in the snack that you had earlier in the day? Do you remember what it tastes like? Or were you just eating to be eating? The litmus test to determine whether or not I'm playing God is a lesson that I learned from the early fathers of the church, in the few centuries, the early first centuries. And here's what they did. They got tired of the busyness, the noise, the confusion of the urban areas. And they went out to the deserts where they lived in caves. And they fasted and they prayed. And they were quiet and they were still. If you were asked to come into this church or any church at some point during the season of Lent, to come into the church alone and to be quiet for 1/2 hour, could you successfully do that? Before you say yes, give it a try. As one young man told me, he gave it a try. He said the silence was deafening, deafening. Because those voices inside, that uneasiness I feel, that anxiety I feel, is the way that I've tried to control my life by making my life busy and noisy. The person who is excessively busy and noisy, who can't sit still, is a person who has been playing God. And if that person's going to have peace, it's not going to come through a medication. It's going to come through silence and prayer. So my brothers and sisters, Jesus showed us the way. He could have played the big cheese. He could have claimed the prerogative of being God, but he did not. Paul describes it best in his 2nd chapter of the Philippians when he talks about Jesus in that beautiful Philippian hymn as we come to know him. Paul says, and I quote, "Though he was born in the image and likeness of God, he did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. And he would humble himself, accepting even death on the cross." Oh yeah, Jesus was not going to buy into Satan's lie. He was going to trust his Father to care for him. Rather than to fix his hunger, to fix his loneliness, he chose to trust in his Father. And he set the bar high for us. I pray in a very special way that you will put yourself to the test and don't let Satan do it. Try spending some time in silence and see what happens. We know what the Lord did.